Hello and welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Joining us for this edition of the program is Carl Alves, the CEO of PAACA, as it's commonly known as, the Positive Action Against Chemical Addiction.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was thinking, as I was talking to you, and I'm like, I've known him for like 30 years. More than that.
Yeah.
And we've talked about, it's funny, as I was thinking about the times we've talked, whether it be radio or whatever, the topics don't change. The efforts do, though.
Sure.
But, I mean, the topics from the 1990s that we were talking about are still there.
They've changed, and it's a little bit more complex. But attitudes have changed, in many cases for the better. And so, there is hope.
Well, the one thing that I think is there's more attention is the only word I can think of. There seems to be more of that now than there was in the mid-'90s.
That's right. Mid-'90s, we were just in the midst of an HIV crisis, an AIDS crisis, and there was still a lot of stigma. But the opioid crisis was actually just taking its next chapter, because that was the period of time where docs were rated, or their performance rating from the hospital was based on treating pain. And so places like Purdue Pharma and some of these other producers of opiates were just coming on the scene pitching these wonder drugs that take away pain but aren't addictive. And come to find out, that wasn't completely accurate.
And it's funny because obviously medicine has changed.
It is.
And treatments have changed.
That's it.
So we can talk about that, but I just thought it was funny that I was thinking, I'm like, we're still talking about overdose and people on drugs and stuff like that. So the topic hasn't changed, but there are things that have changed. And you're right, it's for the better.
Yeah.
I called you up because I saw a story over the weekend on a national show. And we can talk about local as well.
Right,
and
sure.
You gave me actually some surprising stats as we were talking, but I thought it was interesting. I think it was the mayor of Kansas City was saying that, the overdose deaths in this country since the pandemic are up 30%.
30%, yeah. 93,000 people across the nation passed as a result of overdose.
And to me, that's just staggering.
It is.
And it's such a huge increase nationally again from just the previous year.
Yeah. And
it seems, obviously, the pandemic had a lot to do with it. A lot of aspects of the pandemic had a lot to do with it.
Absolutely. I think the jump in numbers is there are a lot of reasons for it. In Massachusetts, we were actually somewhat spared from the huge jump, although we did increase, but it wasn't at that same level. About 2,100 people have passed in 2020 as a result of overdose. And that's one death's too many. But that number is still high, and it actually matches or maybe exceeds our 2016 number, because we've really kind of come together and tried to flatten that curve, as they say. I guess that's the term now. But this is certainly the epidemic within an epidemic, and which has been very difficult and challenging for many, many people.
And the thing that's curious to me is, with all the attention, it's almost amazing that this pandemic had that kind of an impact, because there had been progress made, and it's incremental. I understand that. Right. But I think there was more positive coming out of that, and then in the last year, it's just like the hard work. I don't want to say it's gone by the wayside, but it has certainly stopped.
It is. A lot of the outreach, contact, access to treatment was all changed. So people were kind of isolated in their houses or in their form. The illicit drug trade was impacted by COVID too. It wasn't quite as readily available. And so that, coupled with exacerbated mental health issues because of the isolation and depression and all of those kinds of things, just kind of compound to a lot of different challenges. That, coupled with social determinants like your housing, a lot of people difficulty with that, evictions, those kinds of things, just becomes very untenable.
What are you seeing, because you have so many services to offer there?
Right.
I would assume unemployment rate now was a huge issue, and although it's coming back. I mean, the jobless numbers just last Friday came out, and it was a very good month nationwide.
Yeah,
I know
it's almost the opposite, trying to find people to
Correct.
fill positions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And housing, a huge issue, because rent, you know, I know it's been extended to October, the rent
Right.
forgiveness, but, you know, housing's been a huge issue.
Well, it's an eviction moratorium.
Correct.
Which is not forgiveness. And that's what people need to understand, that, you know, this is meant to delay so that people can take advantage of some of the programs to help pay for the rent, but it's not forgiven.
I know Tony Cabral was saying when he came in here last week to do a show, he was talking about he met a family of 4 that didn't even know the programs that were available to help them.
You know, one of the things that initiated with a bunch of different providers across the community was a daily call. And we did do a Zoom every day at 11 o'clock. And you know, when it first started, we were doing it 7 days a week, but now we're just Monday through Friday, and we have different topics each day. And housing is one of those. And Tuesday happens to be our housing conversation day. And you know, quite frankly, it's the supply of housing. And we're not talking about shelter housing or program housing. We're talking about working class available housing.
Apartments.
How can our sons or our kids afford to live in our community? We're buying a house or even paying rents. And, you know, that is a real crisis in our area, and we really need to kind of, you know, address it. In addition to all of these other things, but I think, as you say, housing is the #1 issue.
And it's crazy because, never mind rents. I mean, you were telling me I forget what you said, $1,700 for
Dean Street, you know, apartment.
third floor apartment, which is pretty steamy up there.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, you're talking houses for sale that are just
Yeah.
through the roof.
Absolutely. And, you know, it becomes unaffordable. I mean, what we're seeing is a lot of people have suffered as a result of the pandemic. People haven't paid rent. Small-time owners are selling out. They want to wash their hands from it. Can't blame them. Plus, the prices are high because this is such a great place to live. So investors are coming in, buying up these properties. In order for them to make their mortgage, they got to jack up the rent. So, you know, the one unit that we operate some scattered site housing went from a $950 a month rent up to a $1,400 rent.
And you're probably talking a 2-bedroom if you're lucky,
Right,
1 bath.
right, exactly.
Right.
And those and that's the challenge, because, you know, the average person, their income, although might have gone up a little bit, not that much.
No.
You know, and so it really is debilitating for a lot of folks.
The word that we both said too, isolationism, with this whole pandemic too. How has that affected how you guys have done your jobs?
Yeah.
First of all, let me start this way. Your facility, your job, you were constantly in the facility.
Right.
Were you able to do that during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a couple of, we have essential folks, so we were down to a very minimal staff, but, you know, we have housing programs and maintenance and other kinds of programs that operated throughout the entire pandemic, so we never stopped.
Right.
Didn't lay anybody off, so folks continued to work, which we were happy for. But it was, you know, it was challenging because the flow of folks coming in really kind of stopped. So we kind of pivoted and worked on basic needs. We did food delivery services, working on trying to do some community mobilization, those kinds of things, you know, when we couldn't get out.
And your facility is really a personal one.
Yeah.
I mean,
It
you
really
can take
is.
phone calls, but you really need
Right.
to see a one-on-one sort of
That's
relationship.
That's it. It is person to person, because oftentimes we'll see people at their weakest and, you know, try to help them, you know, improve their situation, find a better way. And that's usually done in person.
Right.
Yeah, phones work, and we did some Zoom and that sort of thing to the best of our ability. But, you know, if you look at all the mutual aid help, the different kinds of programs that meet on a regular basis, all of that went to Zoom. Some people really excelled on that. But then there were those that might be new or trying to find their way, where it's very difficult.
So when you're dealing with the recovery with people,
Yeah.
their sobriety and the recovery efforts, first of all, I mean, for people to even try the recovery, it's a huge step.
Right.
And a lot of that is one-on-one. Sponsors.
Sure.
people going through it. Is obviously that contributed to the pandemic and the isolation, because now that support staff is just not there.
Right. And unfortunately, addiction really is exacerbated by loneliness and isolation. And that's exactly what the pandemic brought to many people, because they couldn't do what they were normally doing. They didn't have the supports. So it was very difficult for many people. And unfortunately, people's behavior deteriorated, and, relapse became more prevalent. And so the problems became bigger. That, coupled with a steady flow of income and no supports, okay, now I've got, people could support habits or, that sort of thing. However, it doesn't last forever, and there is a day of reckoning, and we're seeing that now.
I was surprised when I saw the piece, because you mentioned about the income. I mean, the unemployment benefits and the checks, in some ways, hurt those people.
It's about choices. It was a lifeline, certainly, for many.
Yes.
And it's tough to paint a broad brush.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, I think in some cases it did, because it kept people from, pushing forward. But I think it was the right policy, because I think overall,
correct.
It really, helped, and it's really about kids and families. And so yes, you're right. It did hurt some people, or it kept people stuck.
Are you finding that the people who are struggling in a sense with substance abuse, is it younger people right now from the pandemic in a sense, because they didn't get jobs either? I mean, they've been struggling too. Is it? I
think it's across the board.
Is it? Okay.
I think I really do. I mean, from the very elderly, who are probably the most isolated out of everybody,
right,
to younger people who are dealing with stressors at home and just didn't have an outlet. Because if you're in a house with an abuser, whether it's violence or substance or whatever, and you're not getting out, you have no recourse.
Correct.
And that's challenging. That's why we're seeing, as kids return to school and that sort of thing, we're seeing increases in the number of cases, that sort of thing. So it's perilous on both sides. I mean, the bottom line is, we need to be care for one another and reach out and check in on folks, check in on those seniors, reach out to your friends that might have been struggling. We've got to kind of look out for one another, and I think a lot of that was happening during the pandemic, but probably a little less so today.
Obviously, I know that you guys were trying to make contact with the folks while you were there, and that must be extremely difficult when you're just relying on the phone, or I guess email, or
that's it,
whatever.
And people doing Zoom counseling and that sort of thing. Some people liked it and did really well, because there's anonymity, there's the transportation is out, but others really need that extra oomph, and they need the energy of in-person contact and those kinds of things. So.
The interesting thing that I saw too was that, when we talked about the overdose, and I saw the report, it said, it started as prescription, as you were talking about, then it went to heroin, and now it's fentanyl. And I guess the source has changed. The problem hasn't changed, but it's the source that's changed.
And sadly, and there's another trend as well, that stimulants are making an emergence, and that stimulants is their methamphetamines are being included and pill pressed. So a lot of young people utilize Adderall to kind of help them. They perceive that as helping them study more and those kinds of things. But unfortunately, the cartels, the same ones that are putting fentanyl into our streets, are also now making meth in pill form, and they're making it look like Adderall. So I ask everybody to kind of be careful if you're getting illegal drugs, because you don't know what you're getting. And we're finding a lot of fentanyl mixed in with the stimulants now too, which is creating its own challenges. Because if you think about fentanyl, you just need microscopic amounts of it, the active ingredient, to create the high and create the drug. It's easy to transport. There are no great growing seasons, all of those kinds of things, and people have come to expect it, but it is killing people.
And it's interesting too because I just saw that the Attorney General, I think last month, had the announcement with Pharma Health.
Purdue Pharma. Yeah.
Purdue, and that's certainly big news. And
it is.
Agreements are coming with other companies too. Mm-hmm. But the problem isn't going away either. I mean,
it isn't. And and the fact is that the drugs do serve a purpose when used as prescribed. Mm-hmm. The challenge is when they're used not as prescribed. And so it's a complex issue. There's been a lot of deceit over the years, but there's a reckoning. And for the first time a few years ago, the amount of opioids being prescribed has been reduced. So kudos to the health sector for recognizing this and dialing that back.
The doctors...
because they perpetually started the conversation. Yeah. And that's how they were trained to do this in the 90s, and then the 2000s hit, and that's when I think things changed as well, because it hit suburbia, it hit middle class. It wasn't just a street drug anymore.
Right.
It was pervasive, and that was part of the challenge.
I'm curious, as it's not that long ago that Massachusetts approved marijuana. Has that had an impact? I don't even know if there's a study to tell you that yet.
I think there are various studies. I'm not an expert on that per se. That said, I think a lot of folks misuse substances or are prescribed pharmaceutical substances to manage anxiety and those kinds of things. We've seen that some of the marijuana products, CBD products, those kinds of things, have had some positive outcomes. And if 6 at one, half a dozen another, but all things being equal, the CBD is probably less risky than some of the pharmaceuticals. But the jury's still out on all of that. I mean, it's an industry now. My big concern is not necessarily the marijuana, but it's the marketing of the marijuana, because that is very, very prevalent. And people don't equate it to alcohol or other drugs, but it is. And people utilize substances to kind of alter their reality or their perception of reality.
Right.
And so if that starts off as fun, and then it becomes kind of a dependence where I need it, I need that glass of wine, or I need that joint, to kind of live. And then once it becomes an obsession where you can't think about it, that's all you're thinking about. That's where it crosses from dependence into an addiction, and that's the challenge.
And it's curious. I mean, we did a show, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, when we were talking about vaping and how big an issue that was, especially for young people.
Sure. Sure it is. And again,
the only reason I thought of that was when you're talking about marketing.
Yeah. And that really is, because once big business is in there making money for it, they're going to promote it. And that's where the risk is.
What do you see as right now, because I know obviously you guys are still doing it, you work closely with police, you work closely with healthcare folks. Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic right now? I mean, as you said, the state is doing fine. You're not fine, but the state is holding steady, I guess, compared to other places. Do you have optimism that we've I don't want to say we've turned a quarter, but we're doing okay compared to everything else?
I think I wouldn't be in this business for 30 years if I wasn't optimistic, right? Because there's so much trauma out there. I'm hopeful. How about that? That we're continuing to get better. Because if you think back to the 90s, there was a tremendous amount of stigma about substance use, mental health, that sort of thing. I think we're moving forward because more people are aware of it.
Well, I think there's I also think mental health, like you said too, never mind the drugs. I think there was a stigma with just mental health.
Absolutely. But I think people are recognizing that depression is a real thing.
Yeah.
And many people experience that. But it is also treatable. And I think we're getting there. It's very much like what cancer was back in the 50s, 60s. That sort of, nobody wanted to talk about it. But then as people understood it more, there was more research, there was more treatment options, and now communities are behind that, doing walks, raising funding, community awareness. And so cancer today, although it's significant and challenging, it's not what it was.
Right.
And hopefully we'll experience the same thing with behavioral health. But it takes years, and it's a work in progress.
Have you? What are some of the things that for your organization? What are the things that you've been most proud of as you've dealt with this?
Yeah, I think the work that we do with other parts of our community. We recently were able to kind of bring together 7 different organizations and apply for some funding to help special populations get vaccination. And that's something that we're very proud of. We were
and you wouldn't even think of you guys for vaccination,
right? But trying to persuade people that to take a needle that might be those kinds of things and reaching populations. But we have experience with organizing and networks and those types of things, so I think that's been positive. I think the other thing too, we just opened during the pandemic, we opened Rise Recovery Center, which is on Belleville Avenue, and a commercial kitchen. So we've been able to at one point during the pandemic, we were producing about 1,000 meals a week for homeless folks, for recovery homes, for some of the fire victims, those types of things, and putting people to work and doing. So we kind of pivoted away from the direct treatment kinds of things and focused more on what can we do to kind of strengthen our community, build those relationships and that. So I think those are some of the things that most of and my people, in my youth department, they've been fast and true the entire time. Online programs as well as some hybrid and now in person. So there's a tenacity, and I think that's what we're most grateful for.
Is that the key to the youth programs, talking to the young people? I don't know if there's one magic bullet, but is that sort of starting them young?
It's connection. It's when, our youth court program established in 2001 it's an opportunity for young people to kind of make amends when they make a mistake.
I didn't realize it was 20 years. I remember when it opened. 20 years, wow.
You're right. And it's really led to a lot of great relationships, both for the attorneys that are working, as well as the respondents, the folks that have gone through it. And I think you're right. Well, it's not just youth; it's adults. It's that interpersonal connection and listening and non-judgmental, and then having some resources and encouraging people, meet them where they're at, and then provide them with some help. And most often, more often than not, people will eventually pick themselves, and that's what we try to instill. It's about coping skills.
Ultimately, they have to want to get. Ultimately, and you've said it to me many times. Ultimately, they got to want to get help too.
They do, but they need to feel the hope that hope is here, and I can do it. And they need a little bit of motivation. There was a school of thought that I came in when I started way back. The person has to hit bottom. Because there was like a common saying, and I kind of bought into it. But as we evolve, and I've evolved, I've changed my language, I've learned a lot. It's not necessary for somebody to hit their bottom. But you
don't want them to hit bottom. That's the thing.
Who knows what the bottom is?
Right.
But the bottom line is that when you meet people where they're at and encourage them to make positive choices, just even little ones. Harm reduction is something that we never talked about. Medically assisted treatment were things that we never talked about. We said, you got to go cold turkey. That was kind of the mantra way back when.
Right.
But today, there are more options, and there have to be because there are so many complex issues with addiction.
When you talk resources, obviously money is the biggest resource right now.
Yeah, I think there's more money floating around now than ever before. And it's a great opportunity for us to kind of make investment today that will have a sustaining impact going forward. And I'm hoping that the American Recovery Act funds will be utilized in a way that will build some things today that will help us going forward. I think we've learned a lot. There's economies and efficiencies of scale, through Zoom and the technology, which is great. But I really, as we talked about, housing is a huge issue,
right,
and we really need to kind of put that as a top priority.
And as you said too, right now, as you're thinking, that is, if you had one issue right now, it's housing.
That's it, and it's not just
affordable housing, I should say.
Well, I mean, workforce housing.
Right.
Something so that our kids can actually live in our community.
Right.
That people can, buy a house and live comfortably on the wages that they're earning down in this area. And it's the supply of housing. It's because a lot of investors are coming in, buying up. And that's what drives the pricing up. I think there'll be a shakeout, but it's not going to go back or lower than it was.
Right, yeah.
But that's the challenge. And across the board, there's 40, 50 different organizations and individuals that are on these calls on a weekly basis. And on the housing call, everybody is talking about housing and available, sustainable,
and it's not
safe
just
housing.
And it's not just a New Bedford issue
No,
either.
great. I mean, it's the whole area.
Right.
And it undermines the future of because if the service industry folks can't afford to live in this area, we don't have public transportation like Boston and that sort of thing that will make it, so somebody can live out and then come in. We don't have that, so it's going to suffer. So we're only as strong as our weakest link.
Well, you got a lot going on.
Yeah.
That's for sure. It's good seeing you.
Yes, you too.
Good updates.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate that. That's going to do it. He's Carl Alves, the CEO of PAACA, Positive Action Against Chemical Addiction. I'm Jim Marshall, the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.